everyone, welcome to the channel. I'm the Eusebius. I'm very excited to be looking at what we will be discussing today. We will be looking at the Passover. Not every detail of the events and what it means and what it stands for, but specifically the name and the action that God performed during what we call the Passover. This study will be looking at a paper by Dr. Meredith Kline, who was an Old Testament scholar, and he held a PhD in Assyriology and Egyptology. And so when it comes to looking at the Exodus with the Israelites leaving Egypt, his degrees definitely come in handy in this discussion. And so we're going to be looking at a paper that he wrote about what the Passover was, what he believes actually took place there. And I'll leave the link in the description so you can read through the paper if you're interested in seeing all the details that he lays out, because I certainly won't be able to cover all of them. But just to read a few passages so we can get into this story and then give an overview of his argument and then get into details as well. This will all take place in Exodus 12, where the plagues have been happening against Egypt in order for Pharaoh to let the people of God go. We are coming to the 10th plague, and so in Exodus 12, verse 11 to 13, it says this: "In this manner you shall eat it," now speaking of the Passover, "with your belt fastened, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand. You shall eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. For I will pass through the land of Egypt that night, and I will strike all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and on all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. I am the Lord. The blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you are, and when I see the blood I will pass over you, and no plague will befall you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt." And so here we're looking again at the idea of the Passover and God passing over the houses or the people, what took place there. And the main argument by Dr. Kline is that the Passover should be better understood as the cover over, with the action of Yahweh, God, not being that he passed over the Israelite houses during the 10th plague, but that he actually covered them while the plague happened. He protected them while the plague happened, right? It wasn't just a passing over them in judgment, but he actually actively protected them while he judged the Egyptians. The two arguments given are that the rare word that we translate as Passover in Exodus should be to cover over or to hover over as a bird. We'll discuss that. But ultimately to be protective over, right? To protect from above. And the second argument, which we will be discussing in a second video, is that the name of the event, the Passover, should actually be an Egyptian loanword. And we'll kind of discuss how it's normally understood of the relationship between the name of the event and the action that God performs, and the argument that Dr. Kline puts forward of how it actually should be understood, right? What came first, the name of the event or the understanding of what God did, right? Did they name the event and then describe what God did during it? Or did they understand what God did and then they named the event afterwards? We'll discuss that as well. But to start, we'll read a verse and see how Kline will state that he thinks it should be better understood. In chapter 12, verse 23 now, we get a good understanding of what Kline says, and already one of his first points will be in this verse. And so, normal translation, for the Lord will pass through to strike the Egyptians, and when he sees the blood on the lintel and on the 2 doorposts, the Lord will pass over the door and will not allow the destroyer to enter the houses to strike you. His translation, right? For the Lord will pass through to strike the Egyptians, and when he sees the blood on the lintel and on the 2 doorposts, the Lord will cover over the door and will not allow the destroyer to enter your houses to strike you. And so we'll note in a minute, but in the beginning we do have the idea of the Lord passing through, and that could be passing over to strike the Egyptians. It's a different word. But then where we have the normal word of passing over the door, he will say that the Lord actually covers over the door and does not allow the destroyer to enter. And so in the paper, Dr. Kline starts off by discussing the Avian language of God, right? The idea that God, language is used of him flying similar to birds and clouds in Scripture. So the same way that Scripture talks of birds hovering or fluttering and clouds hovering and whatnot, that same language is used for God. And we see that in Genesis 1:2, where the Spirit of God is hovering over the face of the waters. A couple of translations will say he moved across, but the majority say that he hovered, right? Is that normal word? He hovered over the face of the waters. A bird metaphor that Kline gives in Exodus 19:4, it says, "You yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians and how I lifted you up on eagle's wings and brought you to myself." So not discussing the Passover, but in the same book, only a few chapters after, discussing how he saves the Israelites, he uses bird language, right? Like an eagle, like on eagle's wings, he brought them up, right? So comparing himself to the actions that birds do in saving and protecting. A verse that I just found during just daily readings was in Psalm 57:1, and it says, "In the shadow of your wings I will take refuge until destruction passes by." And so there we have similar ideas, right? But this even gives us more similarities to the Passover, because destruction's passing over and we are in the shadow of the wings of God, taking refuge. And so even there we kind of see these similarities to this bird language being used for God, it being protection or rescuing, and so that's something that Kline initially puts forward. He really wants to get that language and idea in our heads, because it is an overarching theme in the Bible that we don't often see, that God moves and acts in these ways and compares himself in these ways. And so another verse that Kline wants to give, or gives to continue to get this in our minds, is Deuteronomy 32, verse 10 and 11. It says, "He found him in a desert land, and in a howling waste of a wilderness. He encircled him. He cared for him. He guarded him as the pupil of his eyes, like an eagle that stirs up its nest, that hovers over its young. He spread his wings, and he caught them. He carried them on his pinions. And so there, again, we get this idea of this protection like a bird, right, over its nest. It's hovering over its young. Its wings are spread, and he carries them with his pinions. And so, again, just this bird language being used for God and his protective care. And for clouds, right, in Isaiah 60, verse 8, it just says, who are these who fly like a cloud and like the doves to their lattices? And that's just to show that the same word fly, it's the same word in Hebrew that we see with hovers or flutters for birds, right? And so just to use that language, there's not a different word, at least shown here, that clouds, we would probably compare the way clouds move and birds differently, but in Hebrew, it's just the same word, right? We give it a different English word, but it is the same word to describe how they are in the air, right? They hover in the air. He then mentions just the imagery of angels and celestial creatures, how they have wings and they are in the realm of the sky. And I thought, well, if you're more interested in that, you can look at some of the examples he gives. But from my understanding, most people understand that concept of angels and even other celestial creatures and how they already have an understanding of flying and moving in that sense. And so I didn't see it as necessary to show all the evidence that he gives. But if you look at the paper, you'll see what he has to say on that. And so starting to get into this discussion of the Passover and what it could mean, start off with a quote, right? He says, lexical facts, right? There's two Hebrew verbs that are denoting totally different actions, he says. They tend to be confusingly blended in the current popular understanding of Exodus 12, the meaning of both being expressed as Passover. The first step in apprehending the true nature of the event is to distinguish these two actions from each other and clarify their relation to one another. So he says there's two words that are often translated to Passover, but they're different words. This isn't like a defeater, right? There can be two words that mean Passover, but he wants to say, right, they're distinguished from each other. They're not the same thing, right? And so we need to understand the differences, right? I think a big emphasis on this that might help us think about this is the fact, I think I pointed out before, that the word for Passover, whether it's the name of the feast or the sacrifice or the name of the action that God performs, is that it's a very rare word, and that comes into consideration in a lot of its appearances and how we understand it, right? It's a rare word, so when we see it, we don't have dozens or hundreds of verses to look at and say, well, here's what it almost always means. We have a few verses that have completely different contexts that we have to understand what this word means. And that should always be considered when we're looking at this. But one of the verses that I already read that will show you the distinction between these two words that we understand as Passover normally will hopefully help. In Exodus 12, verse 23, it says, for the Lord will pass through to strike the Egyptians, and when he sees the blood on the lintel and on the doorpost, the Lord will pass over the door and will not allow the destroyer to enter the houses to strike you. Direct quote, Exodus 12 narrative speaks of another action of God that stands in contradiction to the destructive passing over the land. What is clear is that the action denoted by Pasach, the word for Passover, results in the sparing of the blood-marked Israelite homes from the curse of the 10th plague. The question is, what is the specific nature of the action? Is Passover a accurate translation of Pasach? And so in that verse 23, in the beginning, the Lord will pass through to strike the Egyptians, is the more common way to discuss passing over, passing through, passing by. It's the Hebrew word avar, right? And you could say the Lord will pass over to strike the Egyptians, the Lord will pass through to strike the Egyptians, right? I think most translations, if not all, say pass through, because we have the idea that he's passing through the land, right? Not just over the land, but it's the same word. And it also could be that the choice of passing through is purposely chosen so it's not confused with the passing over of the door, the house. But that is the most common way to talk of passing over. Passing through something is avar. And so when we then have the Lord will pasach, the door, and will not allow the destroyer to enter, Kline's pointing out he's passing over the land, but then he's doing something over the door that doesn't allow the destroyer to come in. And it doesn't seem that he's just passing over the door. He's doing something protective, right? He's covering the door. So on page 5 of the paper, he makes a comment that the action by Yahweh, he says, the Pasach act is specific to the door where the blood is put, and the traditional view does not take this into account, he says, right? And that's something I didn't notice as well, is that it does say that he does this action over the door, right? Not there is a verse later that says over the house, and so some might understand it as, right, the Bible often does this thing where it says one thing, a part of something, but it means the whole. So a part of the house is mentioned, but it means the whole house. Or a person, right? It mentions a body part, but it means the whole person. It's strange, but the Bible does that often. And so that could be true, but he just points out that it is specific in verse 23 that Yahweh does this action over the door. So either he passes over the door specifically, where the blood is, or he's covering over the door to not let the destroyer in. And it seems to Kline, and I think it's very good point, that it is not a passing over that is done to this door, but that it is a protecting, right? So the Lord will pass through to strike the Egyptians, and when he sees the blood on the lintel and on the 2 doorposts, the Lord will cover the door, and he will not allow the destroyer to enter your house to strike you. Another quote, he says, but the selection of the door frame as the locus of expiation finds its ready explanation when it is recognized that the Pasach act involved a divine protective presence at that very spot, consisted in a guardianship over that door, right? So he says it's specifically talking about the door because that's how you get in houses. And so the Lord is protecting that spot, right? Not just skipping over it, not just passing over it. He's protecting over that door. And so he then will go on to a discussion of the pillar of cloud that the Lord moves in, right? And this is going into that discussion of how clouds move in these similar ways, but it's more specifically talking about how the Lord, as he is in the cloud and in the fire, he's not just guarding the people, but he's often protecting them as he's in this glory cloud, as it's often called. And so in chapter 13, verse 21, it says, "And Yahweh was going before them in a pillar of cloud by day to guide them on the way, and in a pillar of fire by night to give them light, that they might go by day and by night." So we have this, right? That's what the Lord was doing. He was guiding them. But in chapter 14, verse 19 and 20, it says, "Then the angel of God, who had been going before the camp of Israel," right? And this is where we already see this idea of the angel of God or the angel of the Lord being spoken of, but it's already said that the Lord is the one in the cloud, in the pillar of fire. So we have this discussion of the angel of the Lord, the angel of God being God himself, but we won't discuss that. The angel of God, who had been going before the camp of Israel, moved and went behind them, and the pillar of cloud moved from before them and stood behind them. So it came between the camp of Egypt and the camp of Israel, and there was the cloud along with the darkness, yet it gave light at night. Thus the one did not come near the other all night. So while the Egyptians are chasing the Israelites, the Lord in a cloud protects them by going in between them and dividing them so that the Egyptians cannot continue to chase them during this time. And so he shares these verses just to show the protectiveness that God has, and how this supports the idea of, again, the action of God during what we call the Passover is a protective covering, not a passing over the people. And so now we know that God is protective over his people, but now we want to look at verses where this rare verb, Pasach, is used as a sheltering understanding, used as a protective word, so that we can see that it also is a protective word in the Exodus 12 narrative. And so in Isaiah 31:5, we have this passage. I'll read in the LSB. It says, "Like flying birds, so Yahweh of hosts will defend Jerusalem. He will defend and deliver it. He will pass over and provide a way of escape." And so we have this idea of, right, we're given bird image immediately. We're given the idea of Yahweh defending Jerusalem, delivering it, and then we get that word Pasach. He will pass over and provide a way of escape. And so the suggested translation by Kline, and he will in his paper discuss some of the differing ways that he translates the verbs, right? And I won't go into all detail because, again, I just don't think, I think it's too much detail to be very fruitful for the majority of people. And so I'll just read his translation, discuss it a little bit. And if you're able to go deeper, I encourage you to do that. But his translation is, "As birds hovering, so Yahweh of hosts will cover Jerusalem. Covering, he will deliver it. Hovering, he will save it." And so we see there Kline's trying to point out what he sees as Hebrew parallelism, right? Between the first and the fourth line, the second and the third line, but even the first and second, the third and fourth. And so he parallels, right, the first line, birds hovering, with the normally understood Passover word, Pasach, right? As birds hovering parallels the fourth line, hovering, he will save it, meaning Jerusalem. The second and third line have the same word for cover, and so he puts, so Yahweh of hosts will cover Jerusalem, covering, he will defend it. And so he tries to parallel the first and fourth line and the second and third line, but we also see how the first and second line are parallel, right? As birds hovering, so Yahweh of hosts covers Jerusalem, right? Birds hover, they hover over their nest, they hover over their young. Yahweh will cover Jerusalem. And then the third and fourth, covering, he will deliver it. Hovering, he will save it. And so there's that parallelism between the covering and the hovering action, right? And so the majority of translations will translate the Pasach as to Passover, right? So he will pass over and he will save it or spare it. The ESV, I believe, just says he will spare and rescue it. But Kline's argument is that it should be seen that it parallels the action of the birds. The birds hover, and the Lord also hovers in his protective, covering action of saving the city of Jerusalem. Moving on to another verb, probably a more popular passage, right, in 1 Kings 18, where Elijah is dealing with the prophets of Baal, chapter 18, verse 21, and then verse 26. In the LSB, it says, "And Elijah came near to all the people and said, 'How long will you be limping between two opinions? If Yahweh is God, follow him. But if Baal, follow him.' But the people did not answer him a word." In verse 26, "Then they took the ox which was given them, and they prepared it, and they called on the name of Baal from morning until noon, saying, 'O Baal, answer us.' But there was no voice, and no one answered, and they limped about the altar which they had made." And so in both of these passages, the word for Passover is in both of these, and it's understood as the word to limp or to halt. And that'll be a popular understanding in all lexicons if you look. And so in verse 21, we see that Elijah came to the people and said, "How long will you be limping between two opinions?" And then he says, right, if Yahweh is God, follow him. If Baal is God, follow him, right? So this idea of why are you between these two things, God or Baal? Choose one, right? And the saying is, how long will you limp between these two opinions, right? You're limping between two opinions. Pick one. How should we understand this idea of, if we're trying to show that limping, which is the word Pasach, is hovering, right? We can't really understand that there's some sort of protectiveness that we see in the previous passages, right? So hovering wouldn't be protective in a sense. But there's another note that needs to be looked at in verse 21 that helps us understand how it means hovering, just in its literal sense of how a bird hovers. And that's the word opinions. How long will you limp between two opinions? This word is, I believe, sa'ifa, and I didn't double check. But this word is, again, a rare word. We see that very often in these discussions. It's a rare word that seems to have a homonym, meaning another word that's spelled and sounds exactly the same, which means branch or branches. And so what we would see is seemingly a just as good saying for why are you not choosing Yahweh or Baal, why are you stuck in the middle, right, would be how long will you hover between two branches, right? So the idea of a bird, and he's not choosing what branch to land on. How long will you hover between two branches, right? Not two opinions, right? That might be how it's understood, right? There's these two opinions to choose, Yahweh or Baal, choose one. But the saying is, how long will you hover between two branches? Again, the word limping, Pasach, better understood as to hover, and this word opinions seems to be identified as the wrong Hebrew word because it's a homonym. It's spelled and sounds exactly the same, and it means the word branch. It's actually very strange when you look it up. The word for opinions, you'll see it only appears 2 other times in Job, but it's very weird. It has a variant. This isn't the weirdest thing in the world, because spelling is not always as strict as we might think and like it to be. But in Job, the word for opinions appears, but there's a variant spelling because Hebrew has 2 letters for S. And so it just notes that, right? It appears in Job, but it has a variant spelling. Well, if it's not the word opinions, it's the word branch, right? How long will you hover between 2 branches? Then there's actually no variant spellings, right? The 2 in Job are just the normal spellings, and this word in 1 Kings is actually just the word branches that's spelled this way. And so it seems to not only give a better translation and understanding of what Elijah says to the people, how long will you hover between these 2 branches? But it also solves a lexicon problem of these variant spellings, which aren't problems that really need to be solved, but it just so happens to solve that by understanding this word better. Then in verse 26 of the same chapter, right, as they are trying to get Baal to answer them, the end of the verse says, "But there was no voice, no one answered, and they limped about the altar which they had made." And this is often understood as maybe some sort of ceremonial dance that they might have done, right? There's also the knowledge that they were cutting themselves, and so maybe they were limping because of that, because they were cutting themselves to try to get Baal to answer them. But the suggestion for this, if this is the same word Pasach, which means hovering or covering, that the word that Kline gives, and this is in conjunction with the idea that to hover is parallel with how birds hover. And another way that we translate the word for hover for birds is flutter, right? Birds flutter. You'll see that a lot in the ESV and in other translations. And so Kline says that maybe a way we could translate this right? Instead of they hovered around the altar, as you could say that they fluttered around the altar that they had made, right? Again, this same kind of idea that the limping gave, which is that it's some sort of ceremonial dance, right? They're fluttering around. He even puts like in a frenzy, right? They're running all around because Baal's not answering them. And so that's just a suggestion that he gives. Another comment as well with the first verse, the idea of limping between two opinions. The word between is really better translated more often as upon or over. And so again, this just lends credence to the idea of hovering over two branches, not limping between two opinions, right? Like a bird hovers over two branches. I'm not aware of anywhere else this Hebrew word is translated as between, so it is a good point, at least to me. I actually found that the only translation that puts branches instead of opinions is Young's literal translation, which is a very old translation. But he seems to have thought, that makes more sense. And it's kind of funny, the Greek translation of the Old Testament kind of either maybe had a different text or interpreted it somehow, but it says, how long will you halt on both feet? And so there was something going on with their text or their interpretation, but we can just see there that there's this kind of confusion that it seems changing this word to hovering and this other word to branches just kind of solves those problems and seems to just be better, more accurate, not just it solves these imaginary problems. And one last note on this, I read this in this very large book I have called Figures of Speech Used in the Bible by E.W. Bullinger, written in the late 1800s. Very interesting book, lots and lots of content. But on page 105, talking about this passage in 1 Kings, he brings up something interesting it's not exactly what Dr. Kline says, but it's in the same vein as what he says. Bullinger says, one of the words for defend is Pasach, from Pasach, the Passover, which primarily means to halt. And then he gives a few verses. So 1 Kings, how long halt ye between two opinions? He puts Hebrew, as birds hop backwards and forwards on two bows or on two branches. So he gets this idea, right? Is that what this really means is that it's like how a bird hops back and forth between two branches, right? How long are you gonna hop back and forth, right? Again, as in the 1 Kings passage, between Yahweh and Baal, right? Whichever God you think is going to give you what you want, you hop back and forth. How long are you going to do that? So he seems to have seen that similar thing. But then he adds, because he's dealing with this word Pasach, he adds, hence, in Exodus 12:13, it is not when I see the blood I will pass over you. But it is, and he gives the Hebrew, pasachti alchem, he says, I will halt or stop at you, and the plague shall not be upon you. Jehovah will stop or halt at the door and not suffer the destroyer to enter. So the precious blood of Christ stops the hand of justice and is a perfect defense to the sinner who is sheltered by it. So he gives, a good Christian interpretation of this, right? But he sees this this difficulty with the understanding of passing over. He sees, right? He doesn't see the hovering or covering, but he sees that it seems that the Lord halted or stopped at the door. And that does give a similar idea of the hovering and covering of the Lord. He just simply says that he halted or he stopped at the door, and he did not suffer the destroyer to come in. And so just an interesting kind of discussion of how someone else saw what Dr. Kline sees, but Dr. Kline, with seemingly more information at his disposal, has showed not just that God did not pass over, but that he seems to have protectively hovered and covered over the house and the door specifically. Another quote to kind of end out, Kline says, "In the light of our findings concerning the verb Pasach, the picture in Exodus 12 is not one of God's passing over his people, but of his coming to them and abiding with them through the dark night of judgment on Egypt. Like a hovering bird spreading its protective wings over its young, the Lord covered the Israelite houses, keeping watch over them. He was their gatekeeper, their guardian against the entrance of the angel of death." So again, God covered over them like a hovering bird. He did not pass over them. But that was the majority of the evidence that he gave for specifically the action that the Lord performed at the quote Passover event. The Lord covered over the door. He covered over the house of the Israelites in a protective sense. In the next video, as I stated, we're going to be discussing the name of the event, right? Normally, it's understood that the name, the Passover, or the Feast of the Passover, or the Passover lamb, comes from the action of God passing over the house, right? God passed over the house, so we call it the Passover, right? Now, if we understand the verb to be cover over or hover over, you might just assume the name would be the cover over. But the argument to be shared in the next video is that the name of the sacrifice, the Pasach, is an Egyptian loan word. And a rare verb, Pasach, was chosen to show the action that Yahweh performed that they were remembering. All right, so it's not that God performed an action and they named the event after his action, but that, yes, God performed that action, but that they gave this festival, this feast, an Egyptian loan word as they were leaving Egypt, and then they picked this rare verb that had a word play to describe the action that Yahweh did perform for them. Just to show kind of a passage that shows this very obviously clear relationship. Exodus 12 verse 27, just the normal, right, English, that you shall say, and this is in response to when your children say, "What is the meaning of this service?" That you shall say, "It is a Passover sacrifice to Yahweh, who passed over the houses of the sons of Israel in Egypt when he smote the Egyptians, but delivered our homes, and the people bowed low and worshipped." And so, right, using the Hebrew word for Passover, right, that you shall say, "It is a Pesach sacrifice to Yahweh, who Pasach over the houses of the sons of Israel." So you see that word play, right? It is the Pesach because Yahweh Pasach. And so We'll discuss in the second video. It could just be that relationship, right? He did this action, so we gave it a name that reflects the action. But Kline gives a very interesting argument of an Egyptian loanword for the name, and then he'll discuss maybe what we could call this event if we don't want to stick with the traditional passing over. We want to discuss something that more reflects the protective covering over that Yahweh did perform. But with that, that's all the evidence on the actions of God during the Passover event. I hope this was interesting and instructive for you maybe. I hope the idea of God covering over the people, and even what this could mean for Jesus being our Paschal lamb, our Passover lamb, what that could actually mean, blesses you and encourages you. But stay tuned for the next video where we discuss the name of this event and how interesting this could be. So I thank you for listening, and God bless.